so much of what we're talking about relates to the development of self-regulation, which is the first of our topics in social emotional development that I want to see if we can spend some time in before we take a lunch break in about an hour. And of course, it relates to the issues of the effects of stress on the brain. Are many of you acquainted with this from neurons to neighborhoods volume that was mentioned earlier? Can I simply say that if you aren't acquainted with it, you really ought to be and talk to somebody next to you? It has nothing to do with the fact that I was on the committee that produced it. They don't give us anything for the sales of this book. But I will tell you that it was a labor of love for those of us who put it together, and it was written for you. And so it might be a nice resource. I simply start off with one of the foundational claims of our report, which is that the growth of self-regulation is a cornerstone of early childhood development that cuts across all domains of behavior. When we talk about the development of self-regulation, we're not just talking about children being able to sit still in circle time. We're not only talking about children being able to control their emotions, especially when they're angry and frustrated. We're talking about children's ability to focus their attention in a developmentally appropriate manner on a task at hand, to be able to focus their minds on a problem-solving situation, and to be able to maintain that until they've reached a solution. And all of these are foundational to behavioral competence that has a long developmental timetable. And it's for this reason, therefore, that the California Preschool Learning Foundations has a separate foundation devoted to self-regulation, recognizing that it cuts across, it has effects that cut across multiple domains of behavior. Now, I need to apologize at this point, because I'm about to do something that I hate it when academics do it, but it's necessary in this case. And that is to take a simple concept that we all know the meaning of it and complicate it. And say, oh, well, it's really not just one thing, it's multiple things, and here are some new terms you've got to learn. And that's exactly the situation we're in right now. Because, in fact, what the research is telling us is that what we call self-regulation actually consists of three things. And when we can unpack it in this way, we can better understand some of the challenges that young children face in managing themselves. So one feature, one aspect of self-regulation is the one we most often think about, and we call it inhibition. Simply the ability to resist a strong inclination to do one thing and instead do what is most appropriate or needed. To resist the strong inclination to hit that kid who's taken your toy and instead use your words. To resist that strong inclination to listen to the person having another conversation who's just used your name and instead focus on the person you're talking to. To resist that strong inclination to daydream about this weekend and focus your attention on what the speaker is saying. Inhibition. To resist the strong temptation to do an intuitive mental count and instead use your math. Inhibition is such an important part of our thinking and our socializing and our emotional skills. But that's not all that self-regulation involves, especially when we think about it in a brain-based way. Another component of self-regulation is working memory, this capacity to hold information in mind while mentally working with it. I often define working memory as the contents of your conscious mind at this given moment. And the fact is that part of what makes adults more sophisticated thinkers than young children are is not so much an expansion in the capacity of working memory, but the ability to manipulate it more strategically. And part of the challenge young children face is the difficulty of keeping multiple things actively in mind at the same time. How does this relate to self-regulation? Because part of self-regulation involves the ability to remember your goal while you're also remembering the steps you have to take to get there. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. Finally, the third component of self-regulation is what we call cognitive flexibility. The ability to switch perspective, attention, or mental focus. The ability to look at a situation one way and then look at it in a different way. Our cognitive flexibility is a well-honed skill in the adult mind. Cognitive flexibility is slowly developing in young children. Part of the cognitive inflexibility that impairs self-regulation in young children is the difficulty of taking into account another's perspective while your perspective is so significant to you at the moment. Now, we used to call that egocentrism, but it's not. We know that young children are not egocentric. But we do know that because of difficulties in working memory and cognitive flexibility, they may have difficulty keeping in mind their own very self-evident point of view and also thinking that another person has a different point of view, especially if it conflicts with a child's own. That's where cognitive flexibility can impair self-regulation. Together, researchers call these executive functions. And I just mention that because you may hear about it as this area of research is just mushrooming right now. And as I mentioned earlier, these executive functions affect social, emotional, and cognitive ability. These develop over an extended time, from infancy to early adulthood. I just wrote in my own notes just to illustrate this. All the indicators, the behavioral indicators of developing self-regulation, beginning with a newborn's or young baby's ability to organize sleeping along a day-night routine. You remember those days when your child seemed to have their schedule reversed? That's part of that developing neurobiological self-regulation. A reduction in unexplained fussiness a few months later. Later on, a child's ability to inhibit when they hear the word no or they hear a cautionary tone of voice from an adult. That reflects further growth in executive function. Later, the ability to focus longer on interesting topics that have captured their attention. Later, the ability to play accurately, red light, green light, Simon says, that reflects executive function. Later, the ability to plan and coordinate with others, as in developing a pretend play dramatic scenario or participating in classroom activities. Later, the ability to concentrate on a task while you're in a classroom, selective attention. One skill that grade school children have that young children do not. Later, being able to organize your course schedule to complete requirements for graduation. Later, figuring out how you're going to save for that new car that you want. Long, long developmental process. Let me illustrate some of these skills. Beginning with the question. At childcare, what do you have to do when the group is getting ready to go outside, but it happens to be raining? Many of you have been in this experience with young children. And so children know what they have to do, and it's pretty complicated. First of all, they've got to finish whatever it is that they're doing if they want to join the group outside, and they have to put their things away. Now you have to get ready to go outside. So you go to your cubby, put on your rain gear. Oh, but wait a minute. To put on your rain gear, first you've got to take off your shoes. Well, to take off your shoes, then you've got to sit on the floor, and then you pull off your shoes. Then if you remember why you did that, you pull on your boots. Well, now that that's done, now you can stand up. And once you've done that sub-operation, then you have to put on your hat and coat. If you remember why you put on your hat and coat, then you join the other children and the teacher at the door. Do you see why working memory is an important component of self-regulation? Do you understand why it's not so surprising anymore that we see children halfway through this procedure having forgotten why they started in the first place? And why it can be so daunting to a teacher trying to get the kids ready for school and turn around and realize there are 15 children at various stages of the process, none are at the door ready to go, and they're all kind of confused. And that's because what we've identified is to break down the behavioral sequence that when a teacher says, let's get ready to go outside, put on your rain gear, there are varieties of subroutines that have to be kept in mind in relation to the superordinate goal. And that's pretty demanding on working memory. Children are like us. They can only carry in their active conscious minds at any given moment up to 7 or 8 unrelated items at a moment. The reason you and I do much better than that is because we know how to organize and relate items so that we can hold more in working memory because items are nested in relation to each other. Young children aren't good at this, which is why they can get stuck in a subroutine and sometimes lose the sense of why they're doing it at all. What part of the brain is involved in this ability? It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So one gift I've given you now is that when you go home at the end of today, you can say to your partner or whoever else it is you want to impress, well, you know, I'm just thinking about my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the kind of things it does for me, you know, and it'll sound really great. But it is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that contributes to planning and executing event sequences. It has a long developmental timetable. It matures throughout childhood and adolescence. So to begin thinking about practical applications of this, if we know that children have difficulty with self-regulation in part because of problems of working memory, but we are in situations where children need to enact these fairly complicated sequences of events, how can we help them? How can we provide an assist to that slow maturing dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that will help children be able to manage their behavior, be able to do what they need to do, despite the limits they have in working memory? Ideas?
Break the steps into small steps,
Okay.
like a test analysis.
Okay, so you can break it into smaller steps. In a sense, scaffold the task by breaking it down into easier parts. Good, good. What else can we do? Yeah.
You can provide visuals.
Good, good. Visual aids to help children know what to do. Good.
Everything that has to do with transition, like a warning or a preparation to the children at the time they need it, that have it on paper, perhaps, all those things that you need.
You mentioned several things. One of them, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is attention to transitions. Help children anticipate what's coming up. Another is to help children use their words to guide themselves through it. Research shows that's tremendously effective.
Repetition.
Repetition. These are well-rehearsed sequences. Okay. Anybody done the cleanup song? Yeah, well, that's one way you do it. So a cleanup song is great in part because it structures the activity. So knowing what we do can help us understand how to help that developing brain. And I will tell you, just in anticipation, that because brain architecture is shaped by experience, although there are maturational limits in how rapidly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex will mature, there are remarkable accomplishments we can help children make in self-regulation by building these kinds of practices into their everyday experience, and in that way, helping to shape the development of this part of the brain. Now, I want to give you another example of the development of self-regulation, but I need to have you participate in this. I'm going to present to you a list of words. You can see them in your handout, but don't look at them now. What I want you to do is to look at the words and say the color of the words as rapidly as you can. Are the instructions clear? Okay, and I want you to do this aloud so I can hear you do it. Okay? In rows, I want you to say the color of the word as fast as you can. Here we go. What I really like about this task, when I have you do it aloud, is that everybody starts like gangbusters. You know, they go green, yellow, and then they pause. So which columns were the easiest to do? The ones on the left or the ones on the right? Left. And why was that, of course? Right. Because on the left, the colors of the words are the same as the meaning of the words. Whereas on the right, the colors of the words are inconsistent with the meanings of the words. This is a widely known test in psychology. It's not an intelligence test. It is known as the Stroop Test. And it reveals something amazing about how our brains work. And that is how efficient we are as readers. Now, at this stage, reading is a really skilled activity. It's so skilled it's almost automatic. As soon as I put text on the screen, you read it without even trying to. Reading is therefore a well-rehearsed brain process. It is so rehearsed that it operates more efficiently than identifying colors. So with the columns on the right, your brain is wanting to read the words even though your mind is saying, no, identify the colors. and because the reading operates more quickly and efficiently, you're already saying for that third one at the top row, blue, at the same time that your mind is saying, stop, stop, it's really red. That's inhibition. Where you are struggling to control a compelling response in favor of a second response that is correct but less compelling. Now, this kind of inhibition, and inhibition like this, is really hard for young children. This, of all the kinds of forms of self-regulation they struggle with, is really tough. Partly because of the part of the brain that enables them to do so, called the anterior cingulate, is only just beginning to come online. So it is the anterior cingulate and its slow maturational course from roughly 12 months to 25 years that helps to explain why children, young children, are so very challenged by tasks in which they have to inhibit a dominant response. Whether it involves an emotional outburst, whether it involves knowing what to do in Simon Says, whether it involves having to stop doing what you really want to do in order to clean up what you really don't want to do, whether it involves not saying that new word that you learned at home but every adult responds with a sharp expression whenever you say it, but just makes it more of a dominant response. These are very, very hard for children to do. And we'll talk in a few minutes. In fact, let's talk now. How do we help that old anterior cingulate as it is struggling to inhibit that dominant response, to do the correct or appropriate thing instead? How do we help? What kinds of things can we do that would assist children? Say more about the model. Okay, my wife Janet, who has been taking the lead in writing the curriculum frameworks, has several examples that we have included in them of adult modeling, often using words, so that children are privy to the underlying mental processes that go on. One example that came to mind as you were describing this involves a story in which the teacher has a tray of things, stumbles, everything falls down. And so, in teacher-like fashion, you're putting words to the emotions you're feeling. Oh, it's so disappointing to think that I have to put all these things back on the tray again. But turning to the kids next to them, saying, but if you help me, we can make this go faster. Okay? Modeling, essentially, the emotional self-regulation, if you want children to use it. But, yes?
So is that to say that if I want to be better with the colors, if I want to get real good at that activity that we just did, and my early experience was engrossed in color experience, and then I came here, would I be able to do that differently or better than what the outcome was today?
If you were somebody who spent a lot of your time identifying colors, literally identifying colors as quickly as you could, you would do better at this. Last time I used this with the CPIN leaders about a month ago, somebody came up afterwards and said, my 9-year-old daughter doesn't have trouble with this task. We did it with her last week. She doesn't have any trouble. And we both agreed that the reason was she is not as efficient a reader as adults are. So the other way, of course, of doing better at this task is not to have learned to read. But it's a little bit late for that. But what's so interesting about this is that as you're struggling to think of, how would I do things differently to be more efficient at this task, you're really talking about having to rewire a brain that has been structured as the result of a lifetime of experience. And it's as ridiculous as to say, spend a lot of time practicing identifying colors around you as quickly as you can in order to get better at this, as it would be to say, just not have learned to read earlier. In each case, you're talking about a brain that has been structured by experience to respond in the way that it does. Yes? Good. So enhancing motivation can be one way of helping them through this problem with inhibition. Good. Any other ideas? Yeah. Okay. Providing a lot of reinforcement of positive attention to positive models. Somebody else mentioned earlier, encouraging children to use words. That is one way of helping children in their inhibition. So when children are having to learn to use a mathematical operation, to use their counting skills when telling you how many there are, rather than responding impulsively with an intuitive judgment, which is what their predominant response is going to be, asking them to use words to count can be one way of making explicit that subdominant counting response you want them to do. Does that make sense? I used too many words for that. Okay? Likewise, one of the reasons that we tell children to use words rather than hitting is because we're trying to help make routine that subdominant response of pausing rather than acting impulsively. And using words becomes a wonderful mechanism, partly because you have to get some mental energy going in order to say, it really makes me mad when you knock down my blocks. But as a child is mobilizing the mental energy to say that, they're not hitting. That dominant response is receding just as the subdominant response is being acted. Words, therefore, become a really important one. Did you all hear that example?
No.
It's a really nice example, although it's more of a nice example of the role of cognitive flexibility in self-regulation than in the inhibition. The idea is helping children to understand that there are multiple ways of interpreting another child's behavior. Okay? The classic example, but it's a classic boy example. You have to think of others for a girl. You know, a boy is building with a block tower. And another child runs by and the blocks fall down. You're looking at that and you're going, well, did the other child mean to knock them down with an accident? This stuff happens. But the child who is working hard to build a block tower immediately stands up and gets really angry at the perpetrator. You knocked down my block tower. And what you might well do as a teacher is say, are you sure? Did you see him knock it down? Could it have been an accident? And the reason that is so hard for children to do is their own emotions become activated in the circumstance. They become so aroused that the idea that there is any other way of perceiving the situation becomes very, very difficult. Part of the reason this is a really good example is that by the time we get well into the preschool years, we can already see some children who are adopting what we call a hostile bias in interpreting other children's behavior. So when you're in these situations where another person is acting in a way that could be interpreted as hostile but might not be, they're the ones to jump to the conclusion to say, oh, they must have been mean to me. And the reason that's important, that hostile bias is important, is because it is fairly significantly related to aggressive conduct and to peer rejection. So it's the kids that other children are seeing as always the one who gets offended, who's always ready to fight, who becomes rejected by other kids. And that can launch a whole pathway of social problems in the peer network. We'll actually talk about that a little bit in the afternoon if I get to that part of peer relationships. But it's one way in which the lack of cognitive flexibility can really impair children's social interaction. Let's say a little bit more about self-regulation. One, and this is not going to surprise you when I tell you this, is that stress impairs self-regulation. As one noted researcher mentioned to me in her typically evocative fashion, she said, stress can make someone look as if they have ADHD. Whatever other capabilities you have for self-control and self-management, you put me under stress, and I act like I am impaired, because I am. Likewise, young children who are the most economically disadvantaged also show greatest problems with self-regulation. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that self-regulatory problems are most often identified by kindergarten teachers as what children lack when they are not ready for school. Time after time, surveys have shown that when you ask kindergarten teachers to think about the kids who are least school prepared, and then you ask them to explain the reasons why, they rarely talk about children not knowing letter and number skills. Most often what they're talking about are what we would call self-regulatory skills. The inability to focus attention, the inability to get along with others, the inability to control their emotions, the inability to sit still in circle time, the inability to focus on a task. And what's so really challenging for kindergarten teachers is that they know how to teach the letters of the alphabet. They know how to teach number skills. But what do you do with a kid who simply cannot control themselves, and as a result is making your classroom environment chaotic? And that's often arising because of challenges in the child's life experience. I will mention, by the way, one other factor that impairs self-regulation, and that is sleeplessness. This is the second time I've mentioned this to a group like this where I have seen a whole sea of appreciative nods. You know what that's like. I dare say, by the way, that you know what that's like because of personal experience as well as the kids that you work with. But the fact is that children who are sleep deprived, which we are seeing in surprising rates at young ages, may experience self-regulatory problems in part because they are simply sleeping. Finally, we have to mention, but so important, that cultural expectations significantly influence the growth of self-regulation in children. So that oftentimes what we perceive to be a self-regulatory issue in a child may have much to do with the culture of origin. Because cultural expectations have a lot to do with what children are expected to do and how they are expected to do it in the classroom as well as at home. Expectations, for example, for the extent to which children ought to take pleasure in cooperative conduct versus individualistic achievement. Okay? And you know as well as I that we have children in our classrooms who are encouraged not to stand out and not to rise their heads above the crowd, drawing attention to their work, but rather to find themselves in satisfying activity with others. There are also cultural definitions of socially approved conduct. Greeting adults respectfully who are in authority is, for many families who are sending their children to our preschool and child care programs, a really important part of conduct that children are expected at a young age to comply with. Standing out in the group, such as by asking questions, is also an important aspect of self-regulation where we find very important differences in children's behavior by culture. So that in some cases where you are perplexed about a child who is simply not volunteering much in the classroom, it can often be arising because of cultural values that parents are already helping children to master as part of their family culture that has a very different response in the kinds of classrooms. Perhaps the most important evidence of the importance of culture as it relates to self-regulation come from studies that look at children's temper as it relates to the cultural value system of the family. In our country, for example, and this is deeply rooted in research in my field, we see children who are shy and withdrawn and behaviorally inhibited as having a problem. Right? So when you've got a child who's really shy and doesn't want to mingle and is hesitant to speak up and often is at the periphery, we see that as something that can create problems for the child's peer relationships and for the child's ability to achieve, and we remedy it. And I speak with feeling because Janet and I, our oldest son, was a painfully shy young boy. And in fact, Janet was reminding me the other day, we actually spent some time coaching about how to interact with other kids. because he was so shy that he just spent all of his time at the periphery. Are we agreed that that's how we see this in our culture? That is not how temperamental inhibition is perceived in Chinese cultures, particularly those where samples have been studied in Beijing and other samples in China, where inhibition, hesitancy, to put a positive spin on it, reflectiveness, carefulness, is a much more positively valued. So when we take Chinese families and we take American families and bring them into the common lab, these are Chinese-American families, and we watch how mothers respond to their children, who we've independently found to be behaviorally inhibited in this way, we find Chinese mothers responding very approvingly to the same kind of hesitant, holding back conduct that American mothers express concern, criticize, and try to encourage their children to better stand out, to mix, to put themselves out. And of course, when we talk about this temperamental quality, we're talking about something that's very deeply related to self-regulation. It is not surprising that it's often Chinese children who are the ones that teachers love because they're the most behaviorally self-controlled, and because does that make sense? Before we pause, let me turn back to the question of how do we help young children? And right now what I'm doing is priming the pump because I'm going to be having you turn to each other and elaborate on this. First of all, how do we help children develop self-regulation? The first thing, and I think probably one of the more important things, is to think about whether our expectations are developmentally appropriate. Part of the reason I wanted to walk through with you this question of how do we help structure children through self-regulatory tasks like putting on rain gear to go outside, how do we help them through inhibition, is to begin with the recognition that sometimes we want children to do things that may be beyond their skill. And if we want them to do those things, then we need to help provide assists for their brains to be what they're capable of doing and still. And so, as we had talked about earlier, using visual aids, using songs, using attention to transitions, doing it with them, helping children by breaking down the task, all of these things take into account what is developmentally appropriate to expect. I've heard from a preschool educator that it's always great to tell children what to do, not as much what not to do. Because not to do has to do with inhibiting a dominant response, but you haven't given them a subdominant response to replace it with. Whereas if you tell them what you want them to do, that gives them a dominant response that's much easier for them to enact. One of the rest of you said planning for transitions, and I think that is something that you all know is such an important part of making the day go well. And that is not springing transitions on children, but giving them plenty of time to prepare for it so that by the time cleanup has to begin, children have begun sort of enacting the mental steps that involves. Gosh, you guys have already said these things. Helping breaking up complex activity into smaller parts, structuring their memory for what to do. I want to emphasize again, helping children use words to regulate their actions and thinking. Those of you who know, have background in developmental theory know that the idea of words as a mental assist is deeply part of what we call what is called Vygotsky theory. Vygotsky being one of these great Russian developmentalists who for a long time was working on a skill and about the power of words. First, an external regulator, as children are literally encouraged to talk what they need to do. And only then and afterwards do words become an internal regulator that become part of that internal self-talk that, of course, we all use all the time, right? Right? Okay, help me out here because I hope I'm not the only one who goes, oh, that was good. Yeah, that was a good. stupid, stupid, why did you do that? Okay, so just keep in mind that children don't have that internal language. They don't have that internal monologue. And if you help them do it externally, it helps words become a self-regulator before the words go underground to become part of what we all share in common. We talked earlier about modeling emotional self-control, attentional focus, consideration for others, helping children to see you as an example of somebody who helps to use words, to control emotions, to behave considerately for others, especially if you can talk about the conflicting impulses that you're overcoming while acting in a more appropriate and constructive way. And then finally, again, as one of you mentioned, creating a predictable but flexible daily schedule that encourages self-control by balancing active with quiet periods, individual with group activities, provides opportunities for a timeout. That's a lot of words to simply say that oftentimes self-control is undermined when children are overstimulated, or when children are tired, when children are fidgety. Remember we said earlier the way stress can undermine self-regulation, the way sleeplessness can undermine self-regulation. Well, that can happen over the course of a single day in childcare if kids are not provided with a balance of activities that facilitate self-regulation by enabling them to run out that energy that's building up, or enables them some quiet time that's not always consumed by social activity, and that even provides children, here's where the ecology of the classroom can be so important, that gives children a place where they can take a time out when they're feeling like they're needing a break from everything, where it doesn't, where that quiet place is available to them, and therefore they can reconstitute, reorganize, and come back ready to be more self-regulated. Question, comment? Yes.
It's a comment, and some. Thank you. A comment about telling children what to do, what not to do, and it just, that phrase makes me a little nervous in respect to the fact that young children are expert meaning makers, and they're also looking to us for information, gestures as well as words, about how to make sense of their own emotions and behavior. So I like to name what it is that I don't want them to do out of respect for the fact that they're trying to make sense of the house rules. And so I would rather see that phrase in the same breath. Tell the child what you want them to do. But also, they have a right to know what you don't want them to do. So I know I'm talking against the current when I do this, because there's a history, there's a tradition in early childhood education that we love, which is positive guidance and all that. But I think in a way we throw the baby out with the bathwater when we say don't use the word no, or don't tell the child what not to do. I would rather it be in the same breath, tell them what you want them to do, and tell them what you want them not to do. And they'll make sense of it, I think.
Fair enough. And I think also, knowing you especially, that we're not talking about a child, a teacher who's yelling at a child, stop fidgeting. Keep your hands to yourself. But rather talking about desirable conduct in the context of a general principle by which children can understand both what we're asking of them and why what we're not asking them is incompatible. Okay? So we're sitting here in circle time so everybody can be a part. That's one way of talking about sitting still, paying attention, not wandering off, those kinds of things. So I think that part of what I was trying to emphasize was we're not just issuing prohibitive commands. We're contextualizing them both with a positive expectation that's a lot easier for children to enact, as well as a general principle, which I'll say later on this afternoon, a general principle that helps children understand why these expectations happen. We're about 10 minutes away from a lecture. I would like to do what is always best in circumstances like this, and invite you to interact with each other. This self-regulation issue is so important partly because it's crucial to a lot of what else is going on in children's adaptive development, and partly because self-regulation problems are some of the most daunting we face as early childhood educators. So you simply turn to somebody next to you, an elbow partner, somebody who you'd like to talk to. Simply ask, what are the implications of what we learned for teachers, for children, and also for parents?